There's a photograph that nobody talks about. It sits in a county archive in rural Kentucky, dated 1897. 12 people, all of them share the same last name, all of them are related by blood, and all of them are married to each other. The archivist who showed it to me hesitated before pulling it from the drawer. She said people don't usually ask about this family. She said most people don't want to know. But once you see it, once you understand what you're looking at, you can't unsee it. Because this isn't just a photograph, it's evidence of something that continued for over a century, something that was protected, hidden, defended, a family that didn't just keep secrets, they kept themselves. For generations, in the hidden valleys of Appalachia, one clan built their entire existence around a single, unbreakable rule: no outsiders, ever. The bloodline stayed pure not because of tradition, not because of religion, but because they believed that to let someone else in would be to let the family die, so they married within, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, sometimes closer, and when the children were born with twisted spines and clouded eyes, when the babies stopped breathing in the night, when the teenagers couldn't speak or walk, the family didn't stop. They doubled down, they called it loyalty, they called it survival, but the state records tell a different story. They tell a story of suffering so deep it became genetic, of children who never had a chance, of a community that knew and did nothing, of a silence so thick it lasted 4 generations. This isn't folklore, this isn't legend, this is documented. Birth certificates, death records, census data that doesn't add up until you realize what you're looking at. A family tree that doesn't branch, it loops back on itself over and over, like a noose tightening with every generation. And the most haunting part, they're not the only ones. Across rural America, in places too remote for oversight, too proud for intervention, families like this have existed. Some still do. But this clan, the one in that photograph, they're the ones whose records survived. And what those records reveal is something most people have spent a century trying to forget. The family called themselves the Fugate Line, though that name has been scrubbed from most local histories. They settled in a hollow so deep that sunlight only touched the valley floor for a few hours each day. The nearest town was 18 miles away by foot, further by the winding dirt paths that passed for roads. In the 1840s, when they first arrived, isolation wasn't unusual. Plenty of families carved out lives in the mountains, away from civilization, away from law. But the Fugates didn't just accept isolation, they weaponized it. Within 2 generations, they had created their own rules, their own definition of family, and anyone who questioned it wasn't welcome to stay. The pattern started innocently enough, or so they would have claimed. A young man marries his first cousin. It happens, especially in rural areas where options are limited and travel is difficult. But then his sister marries her cousin, and their children marry each other. By the 1880s, the family tree had become a labyrinth of repeated names, of marriages that violated every biological warning we now understand. And yet no one intervened. The county clerks issued the licenses, the preachers performed the ceremonies, some knew exactly what they were signing off on, others didn't ask questions. In the mountains, you learned not to pry into family business, especially when that family owned half the land and most of the timber rights. But the children knew something was wrong, even if they couldn't articulate it, even if they had never seen another way of life, they knew. The way their hands wouldn't form fists properly, the way sounds came out garbled, trapped behind malformed palates, the way their siblings didn't live past infancy, buried in graves marked only with river stones. By the turn of the century, infant mortality in the Fugate Hollow was nearly 60%. 60%. That's 3 times the national average for the poorest regions in America at the time. And still, the family persisted. Because to admit something was wrong would mean admitting what they had done, what they were still doing. So they buried the children in silence, and they kept the bloodline closed. There's a medical term for what happens when a bloodline closes in on itself. In breeding depression, it sounds clinical, sterile, but what it describes is anything but. With each generation of close intermarriage, recessive genes, the ones that carry disorders and disabilities, have a higher chance of pairing up. When cousins have children, that risk increases. When those children marry each other, it compounds. By the third or fourth generation of continuous intermarriage, you're not just rolling dice, you're guaranteeing outcomes. Stillbirths, severe intellectual disabilities, skeletal deformities, organ failures, hearts that form incorrectly, lungs that never fully develop. And in the Fugate Hollow, they saw all of it. The county physician, a man named Dr. Artemus Hale, kept records that were only recently unsealed. In his private journal, dated between 1902 and 1911, he describes being called to the Hollow more than 30 times to deliver babies or attend to the dying. He writes about children born blue, their skin a deep indigo from a blood disorder so rare it shouldn't appear more than once in 10 million births. But in this family, it appeared in nearly every generation. He writes about infants with cranial malformations, about teenagers who seized uncontrollably, about adults in their 20s who couldn't remember their own names. And in one entry, dated March 1907, he writes something chilling. They know what they are doing, and they will not stop. Dr. Hale tried to intervene. He spoke to the elders, the patriarchs who controlled the family's decisions. He explained the science as best he could for the time. He begged them to allow marriages outside the family, to bring in new blood literally, to save the children being born into suffering. But they refused, not out of ignorance, out of conviction. They believed that their bloodline carried something sacred, something that would be diluted or destroyed if outsiders were allowed in. They believed that the suffering was temporary, that the strong would survive, that God was testing their faith. And when Dr. Hale threatened to report the situation to state authorities, he was told very clearly that his services were no longer needed. He left the Hollow, and he never returned. The children continued to be born. And they continued to die. By the 1920s, the outside world was changing. Roads were being built. Schools were being established in even the most remote counties. The federal government was beginning to take an interest in public health, in child welfare, in the conditions people were living under in forgotten corners of America. But the Fugate Hollow remained untouched. Not because no one knew about it. People knew, the mailman knew, the census takers knew, the social workers who came through once every few years knew. But there was an unspoken agreement. You didn't interfere with mountain families. You didn't question their ways, because to do so was to invite trouble, and the Fugates had made it very clear, through reputation and through action, that trouble was something you didn't want. There are stories, passed down through oral history, of what happened to those who tried to help. A school teacher who attempted to enroll some of the Fugate children in 1923 found her tires slashed and her cabin vandalized. She left within the month. A minister who preached about the sin of close intermarriage in 1931 had his church burned to the ground. No arrests were ever made. A state inspector who came to assess living conditions in 1936 was found unconscious on the side of the road, his records missing, his memory of the visit conveniently blank. The message was clear. The family policed itself, and outsiders were not welcome, so the county looked the other way. They processed the marriage licenses. They filed the death certificates, and they said nothing. But the children, the ones who survived, they carried the evidence in their bodies. There's a photograph from 1928, taken by a traveling photographer who didn't understand what he was documenting. 7 children, aged between 4 and 12. Every single one of them has the same hunched posture, the same vacant stare, the same telltale signs of profound mental delays. They're standing in front of a cabin that's barely standing, surrounded by mud and firewood. And in the background, barely visible, is an adult, watching, making sure the photographer doesn't ask questions. The photo was sold as a curiosity, labeled Mountain Folk, and filed away. It wasn't until decades later that researchers identified the children as fugates. And by then, most of them were dead. None of them lived past 30. The Second World War changed everything, even for families who didn't want to change. Young men were drafted. They left the hollows and the mountains and saw the world beyond. They met people from different places, different backgrounds, and some of them didn't come back. But the ones who did, they came back different. They had seen what lay beyond the valley, and some of them started to question, started to resist. In 1946, a young man named Joseph Fugate refused to marry his cousin, the match that had been arranged for him since childhood. He wanted to marry a woman he'd met during the war, a nurse from Ohio. The family elders convened, they debated, and then they delivered their verdict. If he married outside the family, he would be cast out. His name would be stricken from the family Bible. He would inherit nothing. He would be treated as if he had never existed. Joseph married the nurse anyway, and the family kept their promise. He was erased. His siblings were forbidden from speaking to him. His mother wept but obeyed. And when he tried to visit years later, with his wife and his healthy children, children who could run and speak and laugh without struggle, he was turned away at gunpoint. The family would rather lose a son than lose control. But Joseph's rebellion planted a seed. Over the next 2 decades, others began to leave. Some ran away in the night. Some were helped by sympathetic neighbors. And slowly, painfully, the grip of the closed bloodline began to weaken. But the damage was already done. By the 1960s, medical researchers from the State University began studying the Fugate family as a case study in genetic isolation. What they found was staggering. The rate of congenital disorders was nearly 30 times the national average. The average lifespan was 42 years, and the cognitive impact was measurable across generations. Children born in the 1950s were still suffering for marriages that had happened in the 1850s. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, or would you have been the one to break free? The researchers wanted to publish their findings. They wanted to warn other isolated communities about the dangers of sustained endogamy. But the family, what remained of it, fought back. They hired lawyers. They claimed invasion of privacy, defamation, emotional harm. And in a decision that still baffles ethicists today, a judge sealed the records. The research was suppressed, the names were redacted, and the full scope of what happened in that hollow remains locked away, accessible only through Freedom of Information requests that take years to process. The family won their silence, but they lost their future. By the 1980s, there were fewer than 20 Fugates left. Most of them were elderly, sick, or unable to have children. The bloodline that they had fought so hard to protect was dying. Not from outside interference, but from itself. Today, the hollow is empty. The cabins have collapsed into themselves, reclaimed by vines and rot. The graves, unmarked and unmapped, are scattered across the hillside, hidden beneath decades of leaf fall. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd walk right past them. You'd never know that beneath your feet, lie the bodies of children who never had a choice. Children born into a system that valued ideology over life. And the few fugates who remain, the descendants who married out, who broke free, they don't talk about it. Some of them don't even know the full story. Their parents and grandparents buried the history along with the dead, hoping that silence would be enough to erase the shame. But the records don't forget. In county archives, in hospital files, in genealogical databases, the evidence remains. Marriage licenses where the bride and groom share not just a last name, but grandparents. Death certificates listing causes that don't make sense unless you understand the genetic context. Census records showing households where everyone is related in multiple ways, where the family tree looks more like a tangle of roots strangling itself. And in the margins, in the notes that clerks and officials left behind, you can see the quiet horror of people who knew what was happening but felt powerless or unwilling to stop it. One clerk in 1952 wrote a single sentence at the bottom of a marriage application: "God forgive us for what we allow." The question that haunts researchers, the question that kept Dr. Hale awake at night, the question that Joseph Fugate must have asked himself 1,000 times is this: how does it happen? How does a family, a community, an entire society allow such suffering to continue? The answer is not simple. It's not just ignorance, though ignorance played a role. It's not just isolation, though isolation made it easier. It's a combination of pride, fear, and a belief system so rigid that it could not bend even when children were dying. The Fugates believed they were protecting something sacred, and in that belief they sacrificed generations. They believed that their way of life, their purity, was worth any cost, and the cost was paid in blood, in malformed bones, in shallow graves, in a lineage that consumed itself from within. The Fugate story is not an anomaly. It's a warning. Across rural America, in communities that remain isolated by geography, by culture, or by choice, similar patterns have emerged. Some have been documented, most have not. In 2003, a family in rural West Virginia was discovered living in conditions nearly identical to the Fugates a century earlier. In 2011, researchers in eastern Tennessee identified a cluster of genetic disorders traced back to 4 generations of close intermarriage. These families didn't know each other. They didn't coordinate. But they followed the same logic, the same fear of outsiders, the same belief that their way was the only way, and their children paid the price. What makes the Fugate case different is not the severity. It's the documentation. Because they lived in a county that kept meticulous records, because Dr. Hale kept his journals, because researchers fought to access the files, we have a window into what happened. We have proof, and with that proof comes responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to acknowledge, to ensure that it doesn't happen again. But the truth is, we don't talk about families like the Fugates. We don't teach this history in schools. We don't include it in the narrative of American struggle and survival, because it's uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront the fact that suffering like this was allowed to continue, not in some distant time or foreign land, but here, in living memory, under the watch of institutions that could have intervened but chose not to. There's one final photograph. It was taken in 1987 by a local historian who had spent years researching the Hollow. It shows the last remaining Fugate homestead, barely standing, its windows broken, its roof sagging, and nailed to the door is a hand-painted sign. It reads, "Family only." Even in abandonment, even in collapse, the message remained. Keep out, the bloodline is ours, but there was no bloodline left to protect. The last burial in the family cemetery was in 1994. An elderly woman, the final link to the original generation, died alone in a nursing home 2 counties away. She had no children, no siblings, no one to carry the name forward. The Fugate line ended not with defiance, not with redemption, but with silence. A silence that had defined them for over a century. The hollow is still there. You can find it if you know where to look. The graves are still scattered on the hillside, and sometimes, locals say, you can still hear the wind moving through the valley in a way that sounds almost like crying. Like the land itself remembers what happened there, like its mourning the children who never got to leave, the ones who were born into a prison disguised as family. This is not folklore, this is not legend. This is the story of a bloodline that destroyed itself in the name of preservation, and the real horror is not that it happened, it's that we let it.